For the last 30 or 40 years, racial reconciliation is a term that has been at the front of evangelical Christian consciousness when discussing race. But questions have been growing, especially over the last 10 to 15 years, about whether reconciliation is even effective, let alone whether it is the best approach. My guest today is well positioned to address some of these questions. Reverend Dr. Curtis Paul DeYoung is an author, activist, and academic. He recently retired as the co-CEO of the Minnesota Council of Churches, and before that was the executive director of the historic racial justice organization Community Renewal Society in Chicago. I got to know Curtis before he was in either of those roles, back when he was my academic advisor in the Reconciliation Studies program at Bethel University. Curtis may not have written the book on reconciliation, but his book titled Reconciliation is a great place to start learning about the discipline. You'll be able to find a more complete list of his books in the show notes, with topics including racial justice, reconciliation, multiracial congregations, multicultural biblical interpretation, faith-based social justice activism, and cultural competency. Through our conversation, you'll find that there's still a place for reconciliation today, but that it cannot be fully realized without the presence of justice. You'll also learn more about his journey to this work, how he has vocationally practiced and taught biblical justice, and some more recommendations for how you can be resourced for the pursuit of biblical justice. Now, if you will, join me for this conversation with Reverend Dr. Curtis Paul DeYoung. My name's Eric, and this is the Biblical Justice Resources Podcast. Our conversation will begin right after this. The Biblical Justice Resources Podcast is supported by listeners like you at patreon.com/biblicaljusticeresources. If you're interested in supporting the podcast and helping to resource individuals and the church for the pursuit of biblical justice, please consider giving today at patreon.com/biblicaljusticeresources. Again, visit patreon.com/biblicaljusticeresources to help support the podcast. Now on with the show. I'm wondering if we can start our conversation here talking about a definition for biblical justice. This is kind of the way we're starting off all of our conversations here in some of our beginning episodes. So do you have a definition for biblical justice, or how you think about what we're talking about when we talk about biblical justice?
Sure. When I think about biblical justice, one, it's interwoven throughout Scripture. So we see it clearly stated by most clearly stated by the prophets in the Hebrew Scriptures, and most clearly lived by Jesus himself, illustrating for us what justice is. But it's the idea of creating a sense of equity when it comes to economics, for sure. It challenges oppression. It looks at ways that people feel a need for freedom or liberation. Examples of passages, the one Martin Luther King used to quote all the time in his speeches was, "Let justice roll down like waters and righteousness like a mighty stream." That text gives us a clue in that in the Hebrew word for justice can be both translated justice or righteousness. So in many ways, justice is a social dimension of righteousness, making things right, living a right kind of life. And another one of my favorite passages is, I'm sure many have this as a favorite passage, Micah 5:8. What does the Lord require of you but to do justice, to love mercy, to walk humbly with your God? And I like to kind of emphasize that by saying to do justice with God, to love mercy with your God, to walk humbly with your God. Is that as we do the work of justice, we're aligning with God's will for our societies and for our individual lives.
Yeah. Thinking then, so the way that we met was through the Reconciliation Studies program at Bethel.
Right.
And I think, or I'm wondering, I guess, at the time, it feels like, at least inside of evangelical Christianity, there was a big focus on reconciliation. And now we're at a point where there are questions about the relationship between reconciliation and biblical justice, or justice sort of generally.
Mhm.
So, what are your thoughts on how we can think about this relationship between reconciliation as it was being discussed in evangelical Christianity
Sure.
versus where we are with justice?
Sure. I often think of reconciliation and justice as two sides of the same coin, that they have to partner with each other. But oftentimes reconciliation is defined in very individualistic terms. And I think the early stages of conversations and discussion around reconciliation on among evangelicals, and probably even also among progressive Christians in the early stages, was much more about, let me find a friend of a different race and let us work
Yeah.
together to be friends. It was very much focused on an individual perspective. And obviously, that's important and that's good. But it didn't bring into the picture the societal dimensions of why we have racism. Why do class issues exist with these injustices? And so, to really get to reconciliation, you have to work for justice. Reconciliation can really only truly occur between equals, and therefore you have to work at, I mean, obviously, created in the image of God as human beings, we're equal to each other, but society has put in a number of barriers to our equality. And so the work of justice is to remove those barriers and get us to a place where we can have a reconciled relationship. Another distinction I see also is, I've always thought of reconciliation as a process. It's a
Mhm.
journey that gets us to a point of justice. I guess we could look at reconciliation as an endpoint as well, but I think of it as much more as a process, which is how we discussed it, of course, back then at Bethel University when we were in the classroom having these conversations.
Yeah. That's really interesting. I don't know what order these conversations are going to come out in, but I had a conversation earlier this week with Dr. Patty Pell, who's at Denver Seminary, and
Oh,
she
good.
talked about justice as a process as well. So it's
Yeah, I
interesting to
think,
think about how these are not just like, as you said, they're not just end goals; they're processes. Do you have
right.
any further thoughts on how that works?
Yeah, I think that it's helpful. One, gives us a little grace in the that it is a process. We don't have to arrive tomorrow. That's something we work at. I think the Bible speaks a lot about unity, and reconciliation is a process that gets us to a greater sense of unity in the body of Christ, or as humans on the planet. And so I think therefore we can kind of think about what are the components of a process. And we used to talk about in our reconciliation classes, we had 5 elements of a process of reconciliation, whether it be racial reconciliation or reconciliation around gender, class, or other issues. And we would talk about, first, you have to get in the process. You have to take responsibility that you have a role in this, and it takes two sides to reconcile. One side can't just reconcile by themselves.
Right.
The second part of that, a second feature, these don't have to always go in this order, other than taking responsibility has to start. But forgiveness is an important part of this. And that's often done at an individual, but it can be done at a collective level as well. And then there's the idea of biblical language, we say repentance. But the language you often use more now is about how we do you repair what's been damaged. What's caused the inequities in society are often things that need to be repaired. And even the term reparations gets used sometimes today to talk about that. And then I felt there's an element in reconciliation that only God can do, and that's a healing process, because there's often a lot of pain and damage that's caused by injustice. And then a final piece that we would talk about was, then you have to create a new way of relating. We might call that social justice in society. In a marriage, you might call it, what are the new ways that we interact with each other? Because if you don't change the very structures of the relationships, then you just are doomed to repeat them over and over and over.
Yeah, this is bringing up so many questions for me now. So I'm glad we're here, and I'm glad you brought up the piece about there's a part of this that is God's work to do.
Yeah.
Can you kind of expand on what is God's work versus what is our work as humans in society today?
Um, sure. One is, I think that the we can look at reconciliation in a few different ways. One is being reconciled to God. And that should be the starting point for all forms of reconciliation, is that having a right relationship with God. Um, God is already, through the death and resurrection of Jesus Christ, has already reached out to us. So, it's not like we have to take that initiative. The initiative has been taken toward us for reconciliation. We have to respond. We're in the realm of humanity. Someone has to take the first step. So there's that. Then there's the relationship of reconciliation among us as people, as humans. Then I think there's a societal form of reconciliation, which is what we would often call justice or social justice, and even more today. And being back in the classroom now and teaching Gen Zs, we talk a lot about climate justice, and so that idea of
Mm.
being reconciled to the earth and to what's going on in God's creation. And so I think those are different phases. They happen simultaneously, and the Spirit is throughout all of that. But ideally, one begins by repairing their relationship with God.
Interesting. It brings to mind for me a former colleague of yours at Bethel, Dr. Ruben Rivera. I took a
Yes,
class with him as well, and he had during that class a conversation about how there's the up and down like thinking of it as a cross, an up and down
yes,
relationship with humanity and God, and then a cross relationship humanity with
yeah,
each other. And that's really the only way for that image of God to be fully realized, is for both of those to be emphasized and, I guess, as strong as possible or as realized as possible, is the right
yeah,
relationship, coming back to that language of righteousness between
yeah.
in all of those directions.
No, that's a great, great image. The horizontal and the vertical relationships, right? Yeah,
Yeah.
beautifully done. Yeah,
Yeah. So I this conversation could continue, I think, in a very sort of high level, thinking about this
yeah, right. Of
academically,
course.
which is where I'm perfectly comfortable being. But I know that not everyone has the same mindset as me. So,
Hmm.
kind of, I think, starting to think about some of the practical implementation of how this works, and sort of directing conversation now into what you have done sort of through your career. So, I
Hmm.
wonder if maybe you can start off just with how you came to thinking about reconciliation, encountering it in your vocational journey, your personal journey, what that looked like.
Sure. So after my undergrad experience, which I went to college at Anderson University in Indiana, a school in some ways similar to Bethel University. Um, Graduated from there and moved to New York City to work at a homeless shelter that was run by a Catholic priest. And so had the opportunity to really gain firsthand experience observing the injustices in our society, and also to broaden my understanding of of the Christian family, and the ways of, the whole Catholic Protestant divide, I suppose. Take a look at that. Uh, but while I was there, I decided I need to go to a church of my own denomination, which I'm raised and ordained in the Church of God. Um, and what was drawing me to that was I was living in this Catholic community, going to mass every day. I was working with kids off the streets of New York, and I had been raised in white suburban environments. So this was quite a stretch for me. And so I decided to go visit a church of my own denomination, and there was one in Manhattan. I went, got on the subway one Sunday morning, went up, and unbeknownst to me, found myself in Harlem, which of course is the cultural mecca for African Americans in our society. And little did I know, I was getting ready to walk through the doors of a congregation that was 100% African American. In fact, had probably not seen a white person in the church in many years, because the usher greeted me by saying, "May I help you?" Which is an unusual greeting at a church. And I explained, well, I'm here to come to church, and talked about where I'd gone to school, which was Anderson University is a school in the Church of God denomination. And so I was welcomed and embraced. And that set off a journey for the year that I was in New York, that I was working with homeless youth. I was living in a Franciscan styled Catholic community. And then on Wednesday nights and Sunday mornings, I was at church in Harlem. And the that first Sunday, I went in and sat down and was immediately escorted to the pastor's office because he wanted to find out who I was. And so I went in and we had a chat, and he asked me if I was studying for the ministry. And I had been licensed, not ordained yet. And I shared that with him, and he opened his calendar and asked me to preach for him 2 weeks after that. So the next Sunday I was had to work. So the very second Sunday I was actually at this church, I was preaching, and I had, limited to no experience in African American church context. But the what was actually happening was the pastor was a man close to 60 years old, had no young ministers in his congregation, and really wanted to mentor someone. And so he took me under his wing. I became his apprentice. And while he noticed I was white, obviously, he probably more so noticed that I needed to be mentored and equipped. So he had me preaching once a month on Sunday morning, which is just unbelievable as I look back at it. And the congregation taught me how to preach in the Black church context. And the first few Sundays, as you know, in Black churches, preaching is not a dialogue, not a monologue. It's a dialogue. It's a back and forth. And people would say, "Help him, Lord! Help him, Lord!" And but by the end of the year that I was there, I had was getting less help him and more hallelujah, amen support. And I grew and developed. And what I discovered in this process of being out of my comfort zone regularly when I arrived in New York, coming from the white suburbs, now living in the Times Square region, which back then was a really challenged part of New York. So I'm out of my comfort zone where I'm living. I'm living in a predominantly Roman Catholic community, out of my comfort zone, going to church in a predominantly, or in fact, 100% African American church, out of my comfort zone. By the end of the year, I felt comfortable in all those contexts. I had stretched my comfort zone. So that was an early lesson in my journey in what is required for our own preparation in doing this work around reconciliation or justice, is that we have to be able to step into places where we don't feel comfortable consistently and regularly and allow our comfort zones to stretch. And of course, we learn experientially, and then you match that up with the academic learning or the reading or whatever that helps you understand the systems that we have to deal with. And so that's been kind of a consistent theme in my journey. Wherever I've gone, I tend to step into things that are probably beyond my abilities at the time or my experience, and find this and get stretched. And there's a kind of learning that comes from the grassroots, a learning from being on the street or in the neighborhood or in the community or whatever, that you can learn to a certain degree in academic settings, but you really need the experience of it.
Yeah, I want to put a pin in that point because I feel like there are three different tendrils I want to explore here.
Okay.
The first of those, I think, being it sounds like for you, it certainly was the case for me that sort of this introduction, there's sort of a maybe not an unexpected encountering, but there is definitely some sort of an encounter with seeing something that we didn't know was there in terms
Right.
of discovering injustice. Do you have any insight about, um, like, is that a typical journey for individuals? Or uh, there's part of me that feels like it's maybe more for white individuals than other BIPOC individuals. Is that an accurate read or what you've seen throughout life?
Well, certainly most white folks are raised in predominantly white contexts, communities. And even if there is some interaction, it's limited. Kind of depends on the community setting when you come to BIPOC folks. like I lived and worked in Chicago for a while, which was the city of Chicago itself is approximately one third black, one third Latinx, one third white. And you would assume, hey, that's a great mix, but it was so segregated that you could just live in your communities. And so a lot of
Yeah.
African Americans didn't really know Latinos or Latinas. You know, there wasn't no relationships, and certainly not with the white community. So well, I think it's certainly common and even more common in the white community because of the way our cities, our towns, even our rural areas are segregated by race. It can happen to others as well. It's part of the human dimension. Or you might know something about most BIPOC folks play, particularly here, Minneapolis, St. Paul, Twin Cities, work and go to school and interact in environments that have a lot of white people in them. So they are more schooled at understanding whites than maybe whites are, and understanding the varieties of communities that are represented under that BIPOC nomenclature. So yeah, I definitely think there's some, usually in this journey, in the work for justice, often it's initially just becoming aware of injustice and seeing what's happening in society, and then beginning to engage with people who have been affected by it. And certainly in the journey around reconciliation, again, I think these journeys coincide with each other, but the journey of reconciliation, you can't just do that intellectually. You actually have to have real live encounters with people and make yourself vulnerable.
Yeah. And I think that leads into the second question then of thinking about getting uncomfortable or getting uncomfortable in a way that then expands our comfort zone. Uh, I don't really know how to ask the question I want to ask about what that looks like, but I guess just sort of first in your experience, but then also in seeing other people, what does it look like? Let me maybe come back to this. Personally, it feels like there needs to be some level of what's the right word? Just like a continuing push to go into that. And
Mm-hmm.
at least for me, it feels like it can be easier to want to pull back from stepping into the discomfort. So, what does it look like to do that? And then what does it look like to either continue to push yourself or to build a support system around you to help continue to push yourself into into
Sure,
those areas of discomfort?
sure. Um, as you may remember, when for the majors in reconciliation studies at Bethel University, we required to study abroad. And so
Yeah.
the point of that was to get you out of your normal circumstances and context and immerse you in a different cultural or worldview context. And of course, for reconciliation majors, not just the immersion, but to actually be in a context where they were either dealing with reconciliation or had serious injustice issues that society's faced. So you kind of got a double learning. But a key piece of that was people would live often in homes of folks. So the concept is there is that we need to be stepping out of our comfort zones where possible. It's not always possible. Where possible, if you can kind of immerse yourself in a different context, you'll learn more quickly. But even if it's consistently every week in certain contexts. So you kind of you have that experience of the good side of discomfort, what you learn and you gain and you begin to, and it's really kind of the only way you can see through the eyes of another person, through another perspective, is to actually be in their context.
Yeah.
I had some time ago, a pastor friend of mine told me about a number of Africans. He's a white pastor. A number of Africans had started attending his church, and he was talking about how excited he was for that. And I said, "Well, that's wonderful." I said, "Have you been into their homes? Have you visited them where they live so that you could be in their context?" And he hadn't done that, kind of assuming that they were bringing their culture with them. So they were, but they were changing up likely the way they interacted because they were in a white church context. You're not going to really see. It's like when you decide you want to get married, you need to go to your partner, your future spouse's home, meet their parents, and see what it's like in there. Or even with friends, you go over to your friend's house and you go, "Wow, that's a whole different lifestyle." So there's got to be that. But then your question implied something that I think is very important. You have to figure out how to sustain
Yeah.
is for the real learnings to come and the real life change to happen. Because I would see students come back from, a semester abroad. It seems like a significant amount of time, come back, and then over time, it was like it didn't happen. They could show their pictures to people. It was a lovely, almost vacation with some good stories, but it didn't really alter who they were. So I think there's this need for exposure and learning and gaining. Then there's if the immersion possibility is there, we should definitely jump into that. But then we have to figure out a way to regularly continue to stretch that comfort zone and stay in it and not expect that a one-time or two-time experience will change it. So really what we're looking for is transformation, not just a good experience and some added information. But that's again back to process again. That's a process that takes time and one has to stay committed to it. And then one has to live into that new reality. So if you're really transformed and changed, then you'll determine that your life decisions are different than what they would have been before. Where you choose to live, where you go to church, where you're looking for friends, the kind of work you do, et cetera. Those kind of life decisions have been altered. They're different than what they would have been if you hadn't had the engagement.
Yeah. And then coming back to the third point from before is thinking about uh, you've had professorial experience in a number of different places, or I should say, you were at Bethel and now you have
Right.
a couple of different places that you're teaching. What does it look like to teach that in an academic environment or institution?
That's a great question for this season of my life. I found being an adjunct faculty member, which is what I'm doing right now, means I just sort of drop in for a semester and teach students. So I get to know them in the classroom. And I don't really have, a lot of time. So I really think to teach this most effectively. So what I have to do is a lot of education, readings, encouraging them to, move towards some of this. But the nice thing about being a full-time professor at Bethel is I had 3 to 4 years with a student and a group of students trying to journey with them on this process. So I didn't have to do a one-day anti-racism seminar and assume that all at once the person had learned all they needed to learn. I could do it over the course of a semester. So that's the one nice thing about a semester class is you can kind of develop things over time. You can look at things developmentally over the course of a major or minor. You have a set of courses that you're interacting with students. And so we start, as we did at Bethel, you had a freshman course or an intro course that kind of sort of set out all the themes. But then you work through this process. You took a course like you did from Ruben Rivera and others who were contributing to this. And then you'd have a senior course where you sort of wrapped it up. This is our learnings, let's identify it. And then you'd have a number of experiential kinds of opportunities, whether it be a study abroad or there be an internship or whatever. So I think the beauty, if it's done right, of an academic environment is that you can do both the experiential and the academic or intellectual together. So I experienced this when I went to seminary. I went to seminary at Howard University, historically Black university seminary in DC. I was usually the only white person in the classroom, so I was out of my comfort zone again, getting stretched and developed. And then I was living in DC context, working at a church that did a lot of outreach work in communities, a lot of work around reconciliation. And so I was doing the work, but I was also in the classroom doing the kind of analysis to understand actually what was happening in the work. So I was not just living it, doing it, I was actually analyzing it and learning it and creating kind of the methods that would kind of serve me for the rest of my life, I guess. So I think there's something wonderful. And obviously, if you're not in an academic environment, you do that through reading and, because folks are always writing good things because the structures of injustice, back to biblical justice, if we want to do justice, injustice is structured throughout our society. If you don't understand how structures work, you don't know how to dismantle these systems that create injustice. So you may do really good work because you're very compassionate, merciful folks, and you're dealing with the front lines, but you're not changing the circumstances that create injustice. So you really do need both the experiential and the I guess you call it intellectual. I think they go hand in hand. And some people will obviously major in one and minor in the other because that's just where their gifts and skill sets are. But as a community, as a collective, we need to think of those things functioning together.
Yeah. I want to come back to thinking about academia in a little bit, but I'm just imagining right now someone listening who is not in academia or just
Yeah.
doesn't, even myself, I don't feel like I often have the time to continue with the book study at the same level that I would like to. So, do you have any either advice or any other tips maybe for how someone who is feels like they're just living their life and doesn't have time to devote
Right.
the time that they want, how someone like that is able to continue with the study and the learning?
Well, hopefully you found yourself to a church where the pastor is preaching on Sundays, and some of those messages have to do with what we're experiencing in society, racial justice work or the work of reconciliation. Hopefully that's a part of your church life. Hopefully you have friends that you can have uh, these kinds of discussions from time to time. It's sort of just kind of setting up a discipline in your life. Obviously, some of us, our work lives provide this because the work that we do is focused on work of reconciliation, the work of justice. But I think everybody can participate. But I would say the easier way to err on this is to just read the books and not get into the actual work. Because that's when you step out of your comfort zone. It's a little easier to step out of your intellectual comfort zone because you can just then put the book back on the shelf. I'll get back to that. But I think it's very important to be engaged, whether it's volunteer work or through working with what's going on in your church, or I mean, there's a number of ways to get at that. And a number of organizations that provide opportunities to do this work. So I think that when we do the experiential hands-on work, that's where the something reading or discussion groups, whatever, are helpful for us to sort of explore, what is this that we're seeing? How do we know some of the dimensions that aren't as obvious? How do we not create or develop stereotypes just because of, if you work consistently with low income folks of a particular race, you might think that race or culture uh, was showing the kind of attributes of what the struggles are being low income. So that doesn't give you a full range. And so stereotypes can develop. If I was, usually we don't develop stereotypes about our own group because we see enough range about our own group. But you certainly could live in an area where the poverty is primarily white, and you might think there's something about whiteness that poverty is a part of. No, it's economics. Has little, if nothing, to do with race, except as it's structured in again to the systems of society. So I think there's important, I would say that you try to do some of both. And I wouldn't let you off the hook to say you shouldn't be reading something once in a while. There's so much out there now to read. You know that because that's a part of
Yeah.
what you're developing the resources. There's a lot of articles. They don't have to be full-length books. So much material online now. And if reading is not your thing, there's documentaries, there's podcasts, there's lots of ways to stay educated and keep your mind engaged while your whole self is engaged as well.
Yeah. That leads me to two different things. One, top of mind is resources that you would recommend, and maybe we can have that be the second point of this.
Okay.
But how does a person determine whether a resource is what the quality level of the resource is when you're looking to find something to read? Because as you said, I've been looking through this, and I've got at the moment something like 1,000 books in
Mhm.
the sort of bibliography section of the website, and that, like, going through different publishers, there are probably thousands more to go
Yeah,
through. So how does a person determine what they should look at, and then maybe some recommendations you have?
sure. That's a part of the challenge of the current era is it's just we have so much information to
Yeah.
go through, and so I would certainly, if you look for recommendations from folks, when it comes to this social justice, the Sojourners magazine has good articles, but they also do book reviews. There are still yet a few kind of places where you can find book reviews. Some of those are now on podcasts or online newsletters or whatever. Um, I would suggest that Christianity Today and Christian Century are kind of two of the major publications, also do book reviews, have articles on these issues. So that'd be a place to start. But I would just talk to people that you know are doing this work or engaged, or say, what are you reading? What's been really helpful for you in this process? And and kind of look for word of mouth, because you're right, there's just so much out there, and then you kind of got to determine what your sort of mix of resources needs to be. So obviously we're driven by our faith, so I think faith-based or biblical resources are going to be helpful because they also engage our value system and why we do this. But there might be some issue that say you're really interested in getting involved in addressing homelessness. You need to be looking at what some of the sociologists are writing about why these conditions exist, and the psychologists about what's happening to people who are existing within these conditions. And I mean, so, um, and you could, sign up for a class at a local university, but that's that's a pretty big step, I suppose. But and also the idea, if you can create some book groups or reading groups with other people, you can talk about it. Because I think particularly these kinds of issues, there it's helpful to have discussion partners and not just be isolated in your thinking and your work.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I think that having discussion partners, I was thinking of that as you were talking about having a breadth of experience and seeing that there
Mhm.
are more experiences than maybe just the one that you're encountering. I feel
Yeah.
like having someone who you're able to walk alongside as you're encountering a resource helps
Yep.
you to have that conversation and play off of them, but also then doesn't keep you within your own viewpoint. Because I think you could experience what we could come up with what we think is the best resource on justice, and you could walk through
Mhm.
that and not feel that transformation because you're not being challenged in a way other than just seeing it on a
Right.
page.
Yeah. So I think, yeah, I think it's really helpful if you are engaged in a local church congregation that is working on these issues. Because then that's going to be a part of the preaching, part of the adult education. You're going to be making connections and friendships with folks who share this. So it becomes more of a natural part of the conversation, and feels more organic.
Yeah, I want to think about this as we come back to the thinking about academia and your experiences there. Uh,
Mhm.
to start off, remind me, because I'm not remembering for sure, were you at Bethel as the reconciliation program was being developed?
So what happened, this is the behind the scenes story. Um, this would have been in around 2000, 2001 or two, somewhere around that. Bethel did a search for a campus pastor, but they loaded the campus pastor job description full of reconciliation language. So I thought, well, by then I was teaching adjunct at Bethel, a course on Martin Luther King and Malcolm X. And had been doing that for some years in the evenings, and was working in a reconciliation social justice nonprofit. called Twin Cities Urban Reconciliation Network. So I went over to talk to the provost at Bethel. So I want to hear about this position because I want to see if any of my friends want to apply for it because I'd like to have a partner over here at Bethel in this work. And he encouraged me to apply for it. So I actually applied for the campus pastor position. But in my materials, I started suggesting you need to have some classes for students on reconciliation if you're going to make this a part of campus ministries, and started to put kind of the early pieces together. And there were two of us that were finalists. One who was selected as campus pastor, his name is Eldon Fry. He had strong background in campus ministry and a great passion and commitment to reconciliation and multicultural work. I had pastoral experience. I'd been a pastor of a church, but I had the academic side of this work. I'd been writing already published, and so they decided to hire us both. Hired him as the campus pastor, hired me in a dual role, half-time administration, dealing with developing the diversity initiatives for the school, and half-time faculty to develop some courses. And at that point, a minor in reconciliation studies, but we quickly moved that to develop a full major, and discovered there was a lot of student interest. And so, yeah, so with the Department of Anthropology and Sociology, which is where I was placed, and certainly good connections to the theology and Bible department, we developed the major and the minor. And within even just as soon as we launched it, we had students declaring minors. And within a couple of years, we had our first major. So, yeah.
Yeah. And then you've probably already talked about this a little bit, but maybe we can kind of bring it all into one place here.
Mhm.
How did you think about forming those courses? How do you think about resourcing the students who are coming through the program about what they needed to know about reconciliation in order to go into the world
Right.
and be people of reconciliation and justice, and then to do the work of that as well?
Yeah. So at the time, most of the conversation, particularly in evangelical context, but I would say even to some degree in the more kind of progressive mainline churches, was racial reconciliation. And I wanted something that was broader, more holistic, because I thought the principles of reconciliation can apply widely. They
Yeah.
can apply to individuals, they can apply to society. So we took intentional four lenses that we used: race, class, gender, and then religion. So to look at kind of how do you do interfaith work. And so that kind of guided the core of the lenses that we used. Obviously, Christian University, Bethel University, I'm seminary trained, theologically trained, so we wanted a really strong theological and scriptural core woven throughout. And then using the benefits of the anthropology sociology department, we wanted a social science perspective. So you learn how to do good analysis on society, you get to understand culture. And then what we had to add that wasn't already at Bethel, or it didn't have the potential already, was some folks skilled in conflict mediation, because that's kind of implied if you're doing reconciliation. In fact, I discovered a lot of works in the academic world written on conflict mediation use the language of reconciliation, and they say it comes from the Bible. I mean, reconciliation is biblical language that's then been borrowed into these other disciplines. And so that was kind of the package that we put together. And then the idea, as I mentioned earlier, of the study abroad, set up an internship course so students are actually out doing something, and then help students think about, now that you have a degree in reconciliation, how are you going to get a job? Uh, and
Yep.
so, because no one's heard
Yep.
of it. And so, of course, we encourage double majors or additional minors or whatever. So, but I would say about 1/3 probably of folks did just a reconciliation studies major. So we had to talk about how you could go into the workplace, and this gives you an opportunity to say, hey, listen, what I've learned in this program is I'm comfortable with conflict and have some skills and how to deal with conflict. I understand diversity and can engage in kind of multicultural content. And you bring kind of actually an amazing skill set that a lot of folks want to see in the people applying for jobs. But it made a great double major for, teachers, for obviously ministry people, even business folks, the whole, because you're going to market to a wide diversity of folks. So, understand these core concepts. And so helping students kind of go through their own process, because you had white students, many white students at Bethel have kind of come through white environments because they grew up in the suburbs, went to white churches, their schools were white, or they went to private Christian schools, which are often majority white. And so they were kind of coming out of whiteness into Bethel. And Bethel was, as you remember, was about, like when I was there, about 90% white. So it's still a white environment. So it's helping students who are white begin to engage, get to know their classmates, get into context where they would be out of their comfort zone. Also then equipping and working with students of color, again with other faculty and staff of color, to equip them in skills on how to engage within this majority white context. One of the interesting things about the degree is because of the diversity was small initially, continued to grow in the reconciliation classes. We learned a lot about a lot of different cultures. We have Hmong students, African American students, um, certainly uh, Latinos and Latinas, and occasionally an indigenous student would be at Bethel, and a lot of students of color, BIPOC students, registered for the reconciliation studies courses because they wanted a place that they knew that their issues would be taken seriously, that they were experiencing in society. And then they became reconciliation minors because they were in enough of the classes. It wasn't necessarily on their academic plan. And then a lot of the white students became aware of just kind of social justice issues, and they would be drawn to the classes, and then they would kind of get the reconciliation skill set as well. And then I did a lot of, one-on-one interaction and engagement, along with, obviously other faculty and staff, because you do need to support folks in their journey and walk with them. And as you know, I respond when alumni still reach out to me today. So
Yeah.
I see this as a lifetime commitment.
Yeah. It's interesting to see a lot of myself in some of those descriptions. So I'm one of those people who found my way into it. And now here we are 15 years later from when I
Yeah.
started.
Yep.
Fascinating.
Yeah, it's wonderful. But I mean, that's for me how I measure success in the work, is to see where people have gone in their journeys. And so I have to have kind of a long timeline to determine success. Because really when it comes to sort of cultural competency or understanding of race for some white students at Bethel, they come at zero or even minus. And so you
Yeah.
have to kind of take them through. And so a lot of times it's the graduate degree, the master's degree or whatever in the field that really then completes the process. Because a lot of times after having done reconciliation studies, that's a now changed kind of how they see their career path. So then they get a graduate degree that kind of seals the deal. And I know that was your case as well. So
Yeah. Uh, we're not going to have enough time to get to all the questions I want to ask.
all
So I'll
right.
try and pick my last couple here. A lot of this conversation now, especially the last few minutes, has kind of thought about what it looks like. Uh, we've been talking a lot about skin color, I think is the way I want to put it.
Mm-hmm.
And that is a very hot topic in society today, is how we think about race and how we talk about race. Uh, what is the, I guess we'll just ask it this way. What is the point of talking about race and focusing on race for someone who maybe feels like we should not be focusing on race?
Yeah, I mean that question's getting asked a lot these days. probably even more so in the past. And ideally, we're all human beings created in the image of God. Race should not be a factor, but clearly it is. And you can look at any of the studies that are done on life outcomes or job, no, who has jobs, the economics, home ownership, health disparities, etc. And race is still a significant factor in disparities in people's lives. So if we need to address those core issues. So race, while it's certainly important in our individual interactions, it's the way it operates at a societal level. To me, that is very troubling. That then kind of echoes back to those interpersonal relationships. And I think if people are really honest, they people know race affects what's going on. And I think that it's hard for white people to engage in these conversations because we don't like the language of white privilege and things like that. But again, if you look at the studies, and if I often will use the language of white advantage, that there are advantages to being white in our society. It shouldn't be that way, but it's that way. So let's figure out why that is, and let's deconstruct that. And it's again, reconciliation ultimately happens between equals. So it's all about equity. It's about adjusting that. And I mean, you can see this also play out in gender issues. Women still don't get the pay that men do in society, and there's certainly distinctions there. And we seem to be more comfortable having those conversations. If we just look at it purely around class, it's really hard to pull race out of that. I mean, historically, we certainly would make the case that the institution of slavery and segregation were economic endeavors built around a racial hierarchy. And so then that has all of its generational impacts. So I don't think you can get away from talking about race. I also think that you need to talk about more than just race because it's all linked. The academic language these days is it's intersectional. When folks don't face just one thing at a time, they connect around these issues. So once again, if you are just living in a kind of you're kind of living in your own world, you're not interacting with people that are different than yourself, you're just not gonna, you may not even know these things at a kind of a deeper level. Although I do think in this information age, it's hard to say people don't know.
Yeah. I think my last question for you here as we're coming up on our time. We I'm curious, maybe you can touch a little bit on how you've seen conversations change since you've been doing this work and
Mm-hmm.
from when you started to where we are now. But I'm also curious about if you have sort of any thoughts about where you think we might be going, and tied into that, what sort of hope you have, or
Mm-hmm.
hope that you hope happens for where we go in the future.
Mm-hmm. Well, clearly this is a challenging time for discussing reconciliation, particularly around race and justice. The uh, the new administration has targeted DEI programs and in my opinion, redefined anti-Semitism and things like that. And so, but we've had moments in history where that's happened before. So for me, I have to kind of keep a long gaze in place, even if I'm troubled by what's happening now. I mean, it's one example of the way conversations have changed that I've been thinking about lately is it used to be refugee resettlement was universally supported by Christian people, where they were conservative, liberal, because the Bible says you're supposed to reach out to your neighbor, you're the stranger, you're supposed to welcome the stranger. And you look politically, I mean, President Obama, President George W. Bush, their reconciliation, their refugee resettlement work, very similar. Their commitments, very similar.
Yeah.
And yet now we're in a season where that is not a given, that the church is supporting. So there definitely have been changes. I think around issues of racial reconciliation, I was with some of the folks writing some of the earlier books on multiracial congregations with a team of sociologists. And we had great hope that we would see this movement of congregations becoming multiracial, and that would be one of the answers to racism, because you would be building these kinds of relationships and these social bonds, and this idea of the experiential and the kind of intellectual biblical pieces merging together. And yet the book United by Faith that I worked on came out in 2003, so we're 20 years past that, and it's as segregated as it was then, if not worse, in churches. And some people feel they were kind of sold a bill of goods, that they came into these churches and they still experienced racism in the churches that were multiracial. So there's troubling things. So but as people of faith, we have to remain committed to hope. And so I think part of the hope is the idea of having a long-term commitment to this, and know that things are going to go up and down. Things are going to be challenged. There's going to be seasons for us to stay at the table in the mix, to continue to speak truth to power, to continue to build relationships. One of the challenges of being white, moving into multiracial contexts, is that a lot of BIPOC folks have had bad experiences with white people. They've experienced racism. So they see your white face, they go, that adds up. So you just keep showing up. You keep there and you keep demonstrating that, no, I'm committed to this. What you've experienced is not what I am, but I'm also open to anything you might see that I've missed. And you have a kind of vulnerability. So to me, it's that continually coming back and staying the long term on this work. That's where the hope comes from. And I do think there is a text in Hebrews that says something about hope, faith being things that we haven't seen yet. The hope comes in the unseen. And I think that's so important, because the Bible is pretty clear that we are to, what did I say? Do justice, love mercy, walk humbly with our God. Apostle Paul writes very clearly that we're called to be ministers of reconciliation. And I love that text in 2 Corinthians 5, where he talks about that. And then it doesn't just cut off, it continues into 6. And he talks about it being the day of salvation, the day of the Lord, which ties back to Jesus's message in Luke 4, where he's come to preach good news to the poor and to the brokenhearted, and for such a time as this, as it were. So,
yeah. Well, it feels like a good place to end for now. I feel like we're going to have another conversation, because I've still got a list of questions to go through. So maybe we'll set that up at some point in the future. Great. But thank you for joining me today, Curtis.
Thank you, Eric. Great to see you, and much success in this work.
Thank you for listening to the Biblical Justice Resources podcast. This podcast is hosted, produced, and edited by Eric Beck. To learn more about how you can be resourced for the pursuit of biblical justice, visit our website at biblicaljusticeresources.com.